Okay, so Bible geography, the land of promise, and that's where we are headed for the next few days. Hang on to your hats. What is the purpose and the value of doing what we are doing? Why are we doing this? What is its value? Well, I think there are excellent reasons and purposes. The purpose is to study the physical, topographical, geographical features of the land that God gave to Israel, because we can then interrelate those geographical, topographical features with the scriptures, with the text of scripture. And it's going to help us understand the scriptures better. The value is bound up in this statement that Jim Monson, who was my professor at the Institute of Holy Land Studies and my wife's professor as we studied over there, and he led our trip and taught us, and these were his words, and I'll never forget them. He said, geography anticipates history. When you travel from Minneapolis to Philadelphia, there's part of that trip that is very tedious and horrible, and I hate it. When I'd go to Indiana to study at Grace Seminary, I had to go through this place. What place am I talking about? When you go from the northern tiers of the United States, with the northern tier states to the eastern tier states, where do you have to go to get Chicago? It's horrible, right? Why is Chicago there? Lord, why did you? Well, because there's a huge lake, right? You can't drive across the lake. You have to go around the lake unless you get on a $600 ferry, which I have paid for to avoid Chicago. But anyway, geography anticipates history. Why is St. Paul where St. Paul is? Well, because it's as far as the boats could get up the Mississippi and dock to unload their stuff or to pick up the pelts and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's there because that's where the ships could get. Why is Minneapolis where it is? Because there were falls next to in the river, and the grain was coming into the mills and they needed to grind the flour, right? And so they harnessed the falls. Geography anticipates history. There are reasons why history happens the way it does. Why did, I mean, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'll do that all week. Why did, after they conquered Jericho, why Ai? After they conquered Ai, why did the Gibeonites get all hot and bothered and, pretend to be from a faraway place and come and make a treaty? Why did that happen? It happened because of geography. If Kansas was going to invade Nebraska before they conquered Omaha, they'd have to conquer Lincoln, right? Because that's just where stuff is. Geography anticipates history. So we need to study the physical, topographical, geographical features of the promised land and tie those to the biblical events, because those biblical events are happening in many cases because of the topography of the geography of the land. Geography anticipates history. Stick that in your head. It's so, so important. And think about the geography of your life and where you live and the cities you know and the places you know and the battles of the Civil War or whatever they may be. And geography is tied into that intricately. All right. So the value of this study is that it's going to establish the location of biblical events. Where did this thing happen? When we bought our second house, my parents in Kansas would come up and visit us. We had bought a new house. They hadn't been there for a couple of years. They eventually were able to come up and visit. Our children were young, and they went back home. My mom wrote letters all the time, and she wrote a letter after they had gone back home to Newton. And she said, I'm so glad we finally got to visit your house, because my wife would write letters to my mom. I'm a Beacham. I don't write letters. That's a whole other story. But My wife would write letters to my mom about all kinds of daily stuff. You know, my wife would say in her letter, I was washing the clothes and one of the kids came running in from the backyard because they were playing, and one of them, they'd fallen down, and, you know, I had to run upstairs and get some bandages and stuff. And my mom said, after they had visited us, she said, now that we've been to your house, I can see all of that in my head. When you say I was in the basement doing laundry and one of the kids ran in because they fell out of the tree in the backyard and he had to come upstairs, and, you know, she said, I can see that in my head. You for years have heard the story of David and Goliath, right? Israel is on one side of the valley and the Philistines are on the other side, and David comes down, you know, Goliath is hollering up and challenging them. David comes down, there's a little stream there, you get some, you know, and if you're anything like me, again, I'm spatial. I have to picture that. People tell stories, I have to picture it in my head. And for years and years, I pictured the David and Goliath story. And then I traveled to Israel, and I stood in that valley, and I saw where all that happened. And now, when I see that in my head, I see the actual place, like Mom, you know, oh, now I see your basement, and I see your backyard, and I see your upstairs, and I see your street, right? So this class is going to do that for you as best we can without taking us all over there. I wish we could take us all over there. But it's going to tie biblical events to the place that they happened, and it's going to give us a much clearer picture in our minds. That's why I say you're going to read the Bible differently after this class, because you're going to see, I hope, in your mind the way it is, all right? It's going to correlate that topography and that history. It's going to tell us why. It's going to give us a rationale. Why, after Jericho was defeated, did they go to Ai? Why didn't they go to, you know, Jerusalem? Why didn't they go somewhere else? Why Ai after Jericho? Why the Gibeonites after Ai fell? Why did they pretend to be from a faraway place and make a treaty? We're going to see that eventually when we get to the hill country, and it will give us a reason why Jericho, a reason why then Ai, a reason why then the Gibeonites. And then, you know, fighting for the southern hill country and the northern, it's going to make sense of the reason for that history. And then it's going to clarify biblical perspectives as we have time to talk about things like the weather and the climate and how the topography affects you know, the air movements and the seasons and so forth. What are the early rains? What are the latter rains? I remember hearing that when I was a kid. It's like I grew up in Kansas. It's different in Kansas than it is over there. My grandkids in Zambia are growing up in a place where there's not summer and winter, there's wet season and dry season. It doesn't rain for 6 months, and then it rains for a few months, and, you know, which is much like Israel. So the early rains, the latter rains, some of this cultural stuff that we read, the geography as we have time is going to help us make sense of some of those things. So it establishes the location where. It correlates topography and history. Why did that happen? And the biblical perspective, what does it mean when it says this about the land and about God's work in that land? Where is Israel? Some people, unfortunately, can't answer that question. I remember being in college, a friend of mine, a gal, her brother was in Vietnam. It was the Vietnam era. And for some reason, I asked her, where is Vietnam? And she said, well, I think it's down by Mexico somewhere. I mean, it's really, where is Israel? I mean, there are probably people on the face of the planet who don't know where Israel is. And so there it is, right at the end of the Mediterranean, the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea is this little land of Israel, God's chosen, promised land. This is the land that God chose to give to his people Israel. And it is a small piece of property if you have not thought about that. The dimensions of the land of Israel, modern Israel, confined mostly west of the Jordan River, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, and north to south, is about 8,000 square miles. New Jersey is over 8,000 square miles. I don't know if that shocks you, but it should shock you. Israel, the modern state of Israel, is smaller than New Jersey. That's amazing to me. If you add the Transjordan area across the Jordan River where 2.5 tribes dwelt when they came into the land of promise, so this is now the country, today the country of Jordan. If you add that, now we add another 4,000 square miles, which is about the size, well, it's smaller than Connecticut. And you put those two together, and you end up with about 12,000 square miles, which is about the size of Maryland, the state of Maryland. I mean, this is a tiny, tiny piece of property. And you say, well, so what's so important about this tiny piece of property? Well, God chose it to be the land of his promise to the people of Israel. And we'll talk about why that's important. How long is it from north to south? Well, in the Bible, as you know, it kind of talks about the size of Israel from Dan to Beersheba. It's like saying in the United States from New York to LA. Although, of course, it's a far smaller chunk, but it's a colloquialism for the breadth, in this case, the length of the land. From Dan to Beersheba is about 150 miles. So here we are, Dan way up in the north, Beersheba down here in the south, not all the way to the southern end, but as far as basically the habitable part. South of Beersheba is the wilderness. It's very dry and almost inhabitable. From Dan to Beersheba, 150 miles. Very small. As far as the width of the land from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, now the nation of, the Mediterranean Sea and the western coast of Israel curves like this. So it's smaller in the north, it's broader in the south. So it's about 30 to 50 miles from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. In the north, it's going to be about 30. In the south, it's going to be 50 miles. I mean, that's tiny. It's small. When you think of the modern nation of Israel, 1948, and the United Nations, divides the land between the Israelites and the Palestinians could have had what they are crying for today. We want an independent state. Well, that was offered to them in 1948. And Israel said, we don't like that division, but we will accept that division. And the Palestinians said, no, we are not going to accept that. We're going to drive the Jews into the sea. And imagine, 5 Arab nations invaded the new state of Israel the day it was born, or the day after it was born. And when they invaded, we're talking about 30 to 50 miles at the most in width. And they didn't get the West Bank. Israel was not initially given what's called the West Bank, this mountainous region. They were kind of confined over here onto the coast, and that was like 7 miles from the West Bank to the coast. And God protected them, and they won the war, and the rest is history. We don't have time to talk about that. But my point is, this is a tiny, tiny little piece of property, and we need to grasp that. But it's so, so important. I have overlaid Israel on a map of Minnesota, but if you're familiar at all, I put Jerusalem right in Minneapolis, and you notice Duluth is outside of the boundaries. From Jerusalem to Duluth, you'd have left Israel already. Or from Minneapolis to Mason City, Iowa, you're just about out of property. It's just a tiny little piece of land, but it's the most important piece of property on the face of this planet because God chose it. The names of the land, of course, Canaan. Canaan was a descendant of Ham, the Canaanites. That's a story we won't have time to get deeply into. Palestine is a name that it has commonly been called. Palestine actually was given as a name to this land by the Romans as a kind of derogative term. They're Philistines. Philistines are uncontrollable rebels or whatever. And so that name was given, I believe, by the Romans to this region. And it stuck really for many, many years. Now it's politically charged to call it Palestine. I don't have a problem with that because I don't have a political agenda when I call it that. So you might hear me call it Palestine, the land of promise, Israel. The promised land, of course, is because it was promised to Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 12:15. The Holy Land is its connection to Christ and the Christian influence, the land of our Savior, the land of Jesus. And Israel was Jacob's new name, and the modern state chose that as their name. And I love that name. It's a great name. God gave that name to Jacob and to the people, Jacob's people, Israel. So I may or may not use any one of those names. And again, I have no political agenda. If I call it Palestine, it's one of the names that historically has adhered to this place. We are going to divide this tiny little piece of property into, I believe, 8 geographical regions, and we are going to take them in this order. So the coastal plain will be our first geographical region. We'll move from there to what's called the SHEPHELAH. SHEPHELAH is a Hebrew word. Forgive me for teaching you Hebrew, but it's a word in the Bible for this region. The word SHEPHELAH means low hills. We have a word in English, Piedmont, which are the low hills that lead up to the Appalachians, if I remember correctly, or Appalachians, depending on which way you say that. See, it's not even a problem just in the Bible words, it's even in English, you know, Appalachians, Appalachians, Caribbean. Anyway, the SHEPHELAH are these low hills leading up into the hill country. The hill country we're going to divide into 2 sections. The southern part we're going to call the hill country of Judah. The northern part we're going to call the hill country of Samaria. So that will actually be 2 different lessons. Then we will move to ESDRAELON, or the Valley of Jezreel. It has 2 names. ESDRAELON is Greek, Jezreel is Hebrew. And north of that is the region of Galilee. We think of the Sea of Galilee, which is down here in the southeastern corner of Galilee, but this entire northern region up here is called Galilee. Isaiah calls it Galilee of the Gentiles. We'll look at that reference. Then we will travel from north to south all the way down what I'm calling here the Jordan Rift, this geological fault line that runs from the north to the south through the land of Israel, Palestine, and Transjordan then is to the east of the Jordan River. Today, the modern country of Jordan. We will not have time in this class to talk about Transjordan. Way in the south here is the Negev, or the wilderness. Negev is a word that means southland. So let's walk through each region now as you've seen them circled, but let's give an overview description of each of them. The coastal plain. The coastal plain is relatively flat. It's easy. It makes for easy travel. And therefore, because it's easy travel, everyone's going to be traveling on it, right? You travel in the places that it is easiest to travel, which means this is the major corridor through the land of Israel. People are traveling along that coast. From north to south, all along the Mediterranean coast, this is the easiest region to travel. It is relatively flat. Right next to the ocean, you'll see these brown, red kinds of sands. There are going to be some sand duning along the ocean that you're going to have to avoid. So you're going to travel a little inland to avoid those sand dunes, but it is very easy to travel there other than right on the coast. It's a very beautiful Mediterranean kind of area. It's a great place to go and swim, even in January. It's a beautiful place. But notice the flatness of this territory. A few rivers or rivulets are flowing down from the hills way back in the fog in the distance there. There's going to be good farming there. The farther north you get, the more water, the less sandy. You're going to have flat areas where you can also farm, which makes it a valuable piece of property. Today in modern Israel, huge orchards of grapefruit and oranges and all kinds of things being grown on the coastal plain. The SHEPHELAH are these low hills, the foothills that are leading up from the coastal plain up into the hills of the hill country. Now, the northern hill country, the hill country of Samaria, doesn't really have a SHEPHELAH. It doesn't have the low hills. You kind of go right from the mountains down to the coastal plain. But the southern hill country, the hill country of Judah, has these low rolling foothills that are going to lead us from the coastal plain up into the hills. Therefore, I mean, if everyone's traveling on the coastal plain and you want to get up into the hills, the easiest way to get up into those very high hills is through these low rolling valleys that are leading from east to west up into the hill country, which means that the SHEPHELAH is going to be an incredibly strategic area of both defense and access for the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, the biblical nation of Israel, because they're mostly tucked up in those hills to avoid all of the nations and the hostile forces that are traveling along the coastal plain. The SHEPHELAH becomes a buffer zone between the hills where Israel is mostly living in biblical times and the coast where all the rest of the world is traveling. And we'll talk more about that. That SHEPHELAH is one of my favorite places to visit. It's so strategically important to biblical times, and we will spend an entire session looking at the SHEPHELAH. Here's a picture of these low rolling hills. We're looking, the Mediterranean Sea is behind us. I'll try to keep you oriented. The Mediterranean Sea is behind us. We're looking into the SHEPHELAH, and you can see in the distance the hill country. See that ridge that's running from north to south where the Jews are living in biblical times. They're kind of confined up there most of the time because the nations of the world are traveling along the coastal plain, and this SHEPHELAH, these low hills that are washing off of the hill country in the distance, these are giving us access up into the hill country. Therefore, they become a very important buffer. The Philistines live on the coast, and the Jews live in the hills. And when David fought Goliath, guess where he fought Goliath? In the SHEPHELAH. They're fighting over the SHEPHELAH because whoever controls the SHEPHELAH controls both the hills and the coast. And we will look at that. These are the low rolling hills of the SHEPHELAH. Beautiful, beautiful region with access. Even you see modern roads going in through these valleys and up toward the hill country and that watershed ridge up in the distance. These are the SHEPHELAH hills, and here is the hill country. So the hill country is deep, rugged, V-shaped valleys. Once we move into the hill country now, it is difficult travel. There's a north-south ridge that's going to give us access north to south up on top. But on each side of that, as water runs down these mountains, it's creating these deep V-cut valleys and rugged mountains in the hill country. To the south, we're going to call that the hill country of Judah. That's where the capital Jerusalem was, and the southern tribes, when the nation of Israel split between Judah and Israel to the north, that is the northern tribes. The hill country of Samaria becomes the capital of the northern tribes after the division, after Solomon, after Jeroboam, or the division during Jeroboam. The hill country of Samaria is the northern part of the hill country. So you will see even on this map, two hill countries, the hill country of Judah to the south, the hill country of Samaria to the north. And you'll notice, again, the SHEPHELAH is to the west of the hill country of Judah. There is no SHEPHELAH up here by the hill country of Samaria. So the hill country of Samaria is more remote and more difficult as far as access to the rest of the world. These are the deep V-shaped valleys. You'll see roads running along the edge here. They're not going to run down in the valley because water is going to gush down there during the rainy season. You will see very steep mountainous regions. You will see grains and trees being grown on the edges of these mountains where for millennia, they created artificial terraces. These were handmade terraces where they could preserve some of the dirt that's washing off the top of the mountain. It's damming up behind these terraces, and they can plant some trees and vines and grains, though it's very restrictive as far as travel is concerned. Even up on the top of the ridge, if you find a little flat area, you can build a house, you can plant some crops, you can raise some sheep and goats. But you can see the terrain is very difficult as far as travel is concerned, but that becomes very protective from the rest of the world, right? So there are advantages and disadvantages to the geographical areas where you live. There are advantages to being in Minnesota, right? In June, but not in January. And that's kind of what we're saying here. There are difficulties in living in the hill country, but there are blessings of living in the hill country, and we need to start to think that way. North of there is the valley of Jezreel or ESDRAELON. It's a broad, fertile valley, and it becomes a strategic funnel of all of the traffic that's traveling on the coast there. Now remember, south down here, south of Israel is what country? Class, it's test time. Are you still awake? Are you with me? Egypt. Thank you. So Egypt is down here. And Egypt is always, in the ancient world, Egypt is always a powerhouse, right? It's a strong nation. It's a military nation. They want to conquer the rest of the world, and the rest of the world wants to conquer them. So here's Egypt down here. Here's the rest of the world up here, Asia, Europe. To get from Asia and Europe to Egypt to fight, you have to go through Israel. To get from Egypt to conquer and fight with the rest of the world, you have to go through Israel. When you travel through Israel, where do you travel? You travel through the coast, on the coastal plain. And when Mount Carmel juts into the sea and interrupts the flow of that road, how are you going to continue north? Well, though Mount Carmel juts into the sea right here, there are cracks in Mount Carmel, these little narrow passes that allow you to enter this broad valley. It's called on this map, the Valley of Israel and the Valley of Jezreel, so that all the nations of the world are traveling along the coast, squeezing through these cracks in Mount Carmel. And by the way, if you are a strong military power, you want to control the cracks in Mount Carmel, right? Because everybody's restricted to travel through there. And you want to control the Valley of Israel and Jezreel, because once the main road comes into the Valley of ESDRAELON or Jezreel, it's going to travel on over toward the Rift and the Sea of Galilee, and then north to the rest of the world. So the Valley of ESDRAELON, the Valley of Jezreel, becomes this funnel for everyone traveling from Egypt to the rest of the world, or from the rest of the world to Egypt along the coastal plain. They have to squeeze through these cracks in the Valley of Jezreel. Here's a view of the Valley of Jezreel, broad, fertile. When I see this picture and I see that black dirt, that reminds me of Kansas, right? It looks like Nebraska, where you want to grow crops. There are some mountains and hills there, but there's this broad, fertile valley. Here are the roads. Notice the roads down here. I mean, cars down here. So this is very broad. And the nations of the world, once they squeeze through those cracks in Mount Carmel, are able to travel east and west to get over to the Sea of Galilee and then north to the rest of the world. By the way, here are some of the roads through the modern roads through these cracks in the valley in Mount Carmel, which lead into the Valley of Jezreel. And you want to strategically control these cracks. By the way, is the Valley of Jezreel important not only for the Bible past, but for the Bible future? One of the cities that controls one of these passes, and it may even be this one here, I'm not 100% sure. One of the cities that controls one of these passes is called Megiddo. And the mountain is called Har Megiddo. Mount Har means mountain. Mount Megiddo. Har Megiddo. Does that sound familiar? Armageddon, right? So the last battle of the world is going to take place where? It's going to focus on the valley of Jezreel and ESDRAELON. Why will the nations amass there to fight the Messiah? Well, because that's the strategic valley of the crossroads of the world. This is not just Bible past, this is Bible future. And we'll talk more about the valley of Jezreel and Har Megiddo, the city of Megiddo and the mountain and so forth. North of there, again, we're just covering the regions now. North of there is Galilee. The region of Galilee consists of high mountains with cut-off tops. I think of that like a crew cut on somebody's head. There are plateaus on the top of these very, very high mountains. It's very remote. It's incredibly difficult traveling up in Galilee because we're farther north. There's a rule in Bible geography. The farther north you travel, the more moisture you get. The farther south you travel, the less moisture you get. We're way up in Galilee. We're way up in the north. And so there's a lot of moisture up there, but these are very high, rugged hills that are almost impossible to live in. And so once again, there's this trade-off. Plus it's very rocky. It's just a really difficult terrain. The Sea of Galilee is in the east, the southeastern part of the region of Galilee. So here's the region of Galilee, north of the valley of ESDRAELON, and the sea that we're very familiar with is down in the southeastern corner of this huge region, this large region, very high, plateaued mountains, very few people actually living up there. You can see this huge scarp and these high rugged hills with flat tops is very characteristic of Galilee. Here's an old Crusader fort, Montfort, which the Crusaders built up there to control some of the access in the northern part of ancient Palestine or Israel. But notice how green and fertile it is, but how difficult it would be to live in that region. Of course, the Sea of Galilee is an incredibly beautiful place. It's down in this crack in the Jordan Rift. The Sea of Galilee is actually about 700 feet below sea level down in the Jordan Rift, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's beautiful. And of course, when you think of Jesus, you think of the Sea of Galilee and his ministry, and much of what he did is here rather than down in Jerusalem. He took trips down to Jerusalem, but his life was mostly lived and his ministry mostly carried out up here in Galilee, and particularly around the Sea of Galilee. It's just a beautiful place and a wonderful place to visit. That leads us to the Jordan Rift, which is this huge fault line. It's a huge crack in the face of our globe that runs from Turkey, Mount Ararat, all the way down to Lake Johanna in Africa. One of the early space exploration, experiments back in the days of John Glenn and those guys, these guys were shot up and were orbiting the Earth. And one of them commented on, he said, really the only geographical feature that we can see from up here besides the continents and the oceans is this big crack right down, from Turkey down into Africa. It's this huge fault line, which is in fact the Jordan Rift, which plays an incredibly important part in biblical history, but it is a fault line from probably the division of the continents after the flood that God has used to, accomplish his purposes in biblical history. It's very fertile to the north around the Sea of Galilee and north of there. And again, as you move south, the farther south you get, if you've traveled to Israel, it's very likely that you visited Galilee, you went around and saw the Sea of Galilee, and then you probably drove from the Sea of Galilee down to maybe Jericho or Qumran. And as you drive from north to south, it just within 50 miles or so, it's incredibly stark difference between beautiful, lush, fertile Sea of Galilee down to Jericho, which is an oasis, and the Dead Sea, which is dead. I mean, there's just, I think the 5-year average rainfall is 1 inch every, it's very dry in the south. So fertile in the north, dry as you drive down to the south in the Jordan Rift. But it's a fascinating region to study, and we will study it toward the end of our week. You stand on the edge of the Jordan Rift. We're standing on the Israeli side. You're looking across to the country of Jordan on the other side, and you can see the high cliffs on which we stand and the high cliffs of Jordan on the other side. The River Jordan is running down here in the middle. Fertile, again, the farther north you are, the Jordan River is winding its way down this huge fault line in the earth. But as you get farther south, this is around Jericho and a little farther south, they can grow date palms and things like that are used to desert life. But notice that's about it. I mean, it's very stark once you get to the southern part of the Jordan Rift and eventually to the Dead Sea. It has a beauty all of its own, kind of like western Kansas, western Nebraska. It has a beauty of its own, but it's not the best place in the world to live because it's so dry and a bit hostile. So that's the Jordan Rift all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba. South, the southern part of Israel, biblical Israel, is the Negev and the wilderness. And here's where you begin to see some differences in the ways of spelling, for example, Negev. And that's because of the way you transliterate the Hebrew. Negev means dry land or southland. It's the name we will use for the southern region. These are dry, rolling, desert-like hills, rugged mountains and canyons and places. This is where the people of Israel wandered when they left Egypt. They wandered here for 40 years in this desolate region. Here it is way down here in the south. And I've said this for years. You see one picture of the Negev, you've seen them all. This is the Negev. I mean, this is the Negev. I can show you 100 pictures and they'd all look like this. It's dry, it's desolate, it's rugged, and Israel wandered here for 40 years in punishment for their failure to believe the word of God. But there you are. It does, again, have a beauty of its own, but you really wouldn't want to wander there 40 years if you could help it. Transjordan is east of the Jordan River, the country of Jordan there. It's mountainous and tablelands. We're not going to have time in this class to look at Transjordan, though it would be interesting if we had time. But we are going to focus our attention mostly on Israel. So 2.5 of the tribes dwelt over here on the eastern side of the Jordan River, Transjordan. There are plateaus where you can grow crops. It's really a very nice and bountiful country apart from some of the hills, but those are the coastal regions. Okay, here are the things to remember. The location of this land. This is what I like to call, and can easily be called, a strategic corridor on the face of the earth and the known world in the times of the Bible. This is a strategic corridor. This is an international crossroads. All of the nations of the world are traveling through this region. The road itself is called in Isaiah 9:1, the way of the sea, or the Via Maris is the Latin for it. This main road that comes from the rest of the world down to the Sea of Galilee, through the cracks in Mount Carmel, along the coastal plain down into Egypt. This is the Via Maris, the way of the sea, the international highway. From Asia and Europe to Egypt, from Egypt to the rest of the world, everybody is traveling through this strategic corridor, whether it be Assyria as they conquer Egypt, whether it be Babylon as they attempt to conquer Egypt, they never did, Persia, who did conquer Egypt, Greece, coming more from the west, conquering Egypt and conquering Asia. All of these conquering nations are traveling through the strategic corridor to get to Egypt. And of course, Rome, who conquered everybody. And for Rome to conquer everybody, they had to come from Rome to Egypt. They had to come from Asia to Egypt. They had to come from Egypt back to Rome, the rest of the world. And notice that everything is funneling right through Israel. The Saudi Arabian desert is over here. You can't go that way unless you're crazy, and there were a few crazy people, but you can't go through the Mediterranean without a boat. So you're crammed into this little place called Israel, the size of New Jersey. And you're traveling along the coastal plain and you have to squeeze through these cracks in Mount Carmel. Think of the strategic nature of this international crossroads. It's incredible. The inhabitants of the land of promise were hostile. This hostile culture, the Canaanites, right? 7 nations, God says, greater and mightier than you. When the Lord God brings you into the land, this is Deuteronomy 7. He's cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, Girgashites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. The Lord will deliver them into your hand if you trust him, believe him. You will smite them, utterly destroy them, make no covenant with them. You shall make no marriages with them. They will turn away your sons from following me. But thus you shall deal with them, verse 5, destroy their altars, break down their images. You are a holy people, be different than them. But I'm sending you into this land to conquer these hostile people who are anti-God and anti-truth. And their culture is steeped in wickedness, which is why God sent Israel in to destroy them. I have a 3-hour lecture on why would God command Israel to exterminate not just the military men of Canaan, but the women, the children, the infants, go in there and completely exterminate them. How is that different than Muslim jihad? Why would God command Israel to exterminate these 7 nations? I have a 3-hour lecture on that. We don't have time for it. But it's an incredibly important study, which goes back to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Canaan, and all kinds of things, which I can't get into at this point. But God is sending them into a land that's not only an international crossroads, it's full of hostile nations that are bigger and more powerful than them and are living totally contrary to the way God would have anyone live. And here are these Canaanites, and you need to go in there and drive them out. The terrain of the land is rugged topographically. It's a land of constriction. It's hills and valleys. You are forced to travel in certain places, according to Deuteronomy 11. The land where you are going to possess is not like the land of Egypt from whence you came, where you sowed your seed, you watered it with your foot, which is talking about treadmills that you would push with your foot. You would pedal like a bike, which would bring water up from the Nile into the fields. But the land where you're going is a land of hills and valleys, and it consumes the water. The rain of heaven falls on it, it just like sucks it in. Egypt had the Nile River. There was always water in Egypt, but you're going to a rugged land where the water just soaks in, and it's a difficult land to live in topographically. Here's Egypt. Look at the green. I mean, the Delta, and that's where they lived. They lived in the Delta region, and there was water there all the time. You just had to create, a mechanism to get it from the Nile into your fields, but there was plenty of water in Egypt. Here's where you're going. Yes, there are places where you can grow crops and God will send rain in his time if you are obedient, but it's going to be a difficult land topographically, which means it's a difficult land climatologically. The climate of the land, there's variable weathers. There's a dry season and a wet season, and if the wet season doesn't come at the right time, you're not going to have time to grow your crops. The weather is variable. It's contingent on all kinds of factors, which we may have some time to talk about. But the Lord can either shut up or open up the heavens depending on if you're obeying me or not. If you're living according to the covenant. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on this land. This is his land, his promised land to you. And he will bless it if you hearken diligently to my commandments. I will give you the rain of your land in due season, the first rain, the early rains, the latter rains. I will send grass in your fields. Take heed to yourselves, that your heart be not deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods. Then the Lord's wrath will be kindled on you, and he will shut up the heavens, and there will be no rain, and the land will not yield her fruit. These are the blessings and the curses of the Mosaic covenant. If you love me and believe me and obey me, you'll have everything you need. This land can provide it for you. But if you don't obey me, this land will hold back from you what you need to survive. You need to trust me and live for me. Be careful. Deuteronomy 6:1, to obey so that it may go well with you and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey. It's a land flowing with milk and honey as long as God's blessing is on it. But if you disobey me and my blessing is removed from you, it can be a very difficult place to live. People in Israel love to see this, a rain cloud, a rainstorm coming and watering the ground, and grass is growing and flowers are popping up. But if the rains don't come at the right time, it can look like Kansas or Nebraska, right? You've seen this in drought. And there are times when your crops are going to just dry up and your fields are going to be as hard as rock because the weather is variable. So here are the lessons that we need to learn. The land of promise is not always as we might imagine it. It's not a region of isolation. It's not some remote corner of the world. It's not void of pagan influence. It's full of Canaanites who were the most corrupt, wicked, godless. I mean, they lived in a way that I can hardly even talk about, though the Bible talks about it. And that's part of the lecture on why God would exterminate these people. It was a fertility cult. Their whole religion was based on licentious sexual activity. And God said, that's where you're going. You're going to live in the middle of these people, and you need to exterminate them and live differently than they did. It's not a place of void of pagan influence. He put them right in the middle of the worst pagans on the face of the earth. It's not a land of relaxation with broad roads and lush fields where you just sit back and watch your crops grow and nobody's going to bother you. It's not a land of automation with instant rain and bumper crops and lots of kids and lots of flocks and everything's happy. No, it's not isolation, segregation, relaxation, or automation. It's God's testing ground of faith. That's what we're talking about this week. Not just the geography of Israel. This is where God put his chosen people to test them, to see if they would keep his covenant and obey his word. It's a crossroads for everybody. Everybody wants to conquer this region. Religiously, it's corrupt, completely spiritually destitute. Physically, it's constricted. Materially, it's complex. And God says, I'm putting you in Canaan. Why would he do that? The Bible is a record of the actions and attitudes of God's people under the fires of adversity. God's goal in putting them in this place was that they might know him, which would cause them to trust, because he is the one and only true God. Know who I am and trust me and love me, because if you love me, you will keep my word. Deuteronomy 6, the great Shema. This is Israel's theme verse. This is their John 3:16. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God is Yahweh exclusively. There is no other God. Know me and love me with all your heart, all your soul, all your might. These words that I command you this day shall be on your heart. And I'm going to put you in this place, Canaan. I've sculpted this land specifically for you. Every hill and every valley and everything that's happening there is sculpted just for you. This is God's playing field. This is God's chessboard specifically designed for his people to test them so that they might know him and love him. And that's what we're going to talk about all this week.